They didn't have spice racks. They didn't have cookbooks. They didn't even have forks. But somehow, medieval peasants knew how to keep body and soul stitched together with the simplest food imaginable. When your pantry is little more than a sack of barley, a clay jar of salt, and whatever root vegetable you can yank from the dirt before frost sets in, you learn a thing or two about making do. Let's get one thing straight. This wasn't glamorous eating. These were meals born of survival, not style. But in the soot-smudged corners of thatched cottages, beside open hearths and under the watchful eyes of hungry children, something beautiful happened. With little more than a blackened pot and a wooden spoon, these folks cooked up nourishment that carried them through backbreaking labor, harsh winters, and centuries of famine and war. Peasant food wasn't flashy, but it was clever. It was economical. It was full of texture, earthy flavors, and gut-filling satisfaction. A bubbling pot of pottage could stretch for days. A hunk of coarse rye bread could feed a whole family when dipped in soup. Every scrap was saved, every root and herb had its purpose, and nothing went to waste. This episode is a tribute to those forgotten kitchens and the people who kept them warm. We're stepping back into the mud-tracked, smoke-filled world of medieval peasantry to uncover the 25 cheap meals that didn't just fill stomachs, they kept people alive. 1. Pottage, the backbone of the peasant table. In medieval times, the smell of pottage was as common as church bells ringing on a Sunday morning or the squelch of muddy boots after a downpour. If you were a peasant, pottage wasn't just food. It was your lifeline. It could be your breakfast, lunch, dinner, and occasionally your midnight snack if you were fortunate enough to have a moment to yourself. It wasn't so much a recipe passed down from generation to generation as it was a way of life, a symbol of the resourcefulness that defined survival in the medieval world. This humble dish was a slow simmering stew, often cooked over the open flame of a hearth, crafted from whatever you could find or forage. At its heart, pottage was a thick, bubbling blend of grains, vegetables, and herbs. Barley or oats often provided the base, giving it substance and filling power, while onions, leeks, and wild greens added flavor. A handful of herbs, foraged from the garden or the wilds, could bring a depth of taste to the mix. If you had turnips, carrots, or parsnips left from the harvest, they went. Nothing went to waste. The pot was a reflection of whatever was available at the time, and there was no wrong way to make it. Pottage was about making do and doing it with what you had. Occasionally, a bone would find its way into the pot, meaty or not, lending a slight richness to the otherwise plant-based stew. But more often than not, it was just plants and grain, simmering away in a simple concoction. The beauty of pottage was its versatility. It was cooked over the fire all day, sometimes even for several days, with ingredients added as they became available. Think of it as a medieval endless stew, a continuous cycle of nourishment, with the pot never leaving the hearth. As the days went on, the flavors deepened and mingled, and the consistency would change. One day thin and brothy, the next thick as porridge. Each region added its own little twist to pottage, making it a dish that was unique but universally known. In England, peasants might throw in some wild sorrel or nettles to give the pot a bite. In France, garlic and herbs from the garden would flavor the mix, adding richness to the earthiness. But the core principle was always the same: use what you have and waste nothing. Every ingredient was cherished. Every morsel was valued. To recreate your own version of this peasant staple, begin with barley and water in a pot. Add chopped onions, garlic, and a handful of greens like kale or spinach. Simmer it low and slow, letting the ingredients meld together. A pinch of thyme and a touch of salt will help bring it all together, and if you're feeling adventurous, a parsnip might add an unexpected sweetness. The goal is to cook it until it's soft enough to eat with a wooden spoon, hearty enough to keep you fueled through the day, and warm enough to comfort you on a chilly evening. Pottage wasn't pretty. It wasn't refined or elegant, but it was reliable, nourishing, and warm. Exactly what a medieval peasant needed after a long day toiling in the fields. It was the soul of their diet, a dish that saw them through hard winters, grueling labor, and the harshness of life. And in its simplicity, it carried a quiet sense of pride. This was food that kept people alive, day in and day out. 2. Rye bread, the daily brick of survival. Rye bread was the medieval peasant's loaf of choice, not because it was the tastiest, but because it was the most forgiving. While wheat requires fertile soil, warmth, and long growing seasons, rye was a hardy underdog, capable of thriving in cold soil, poor land, and short growing seasons. To the average peasant, rye was more than just a grain. It was a reliable source of sustenance that could be relied upon year-round, no matter the conditions. Unlike the fluffy white loaves reserved for the wealthy, nobles and clergy who could afford refined flour, peasant rye bread was dense, dark, and coarse. It was far from the light, airy bread we associate with modern bakeries. In fact, a loaf of rye could easily double as a hammer if it needed to, but that density meant it was packed with the calories, fiber, and staying power needed for survival. It might not have been the centerpiece of a feast, but it was filling, durable, and, most importantly, cheap. In a world where resources were limited, rye bread's resilience made it an essential part of every peasant's diet. The process of making rye bread at home was a labor-intensive one. The flour used was coarse and gritty, often ground at the local mill if the peasant could afford it, or by hand if they couldn't. Sifting it to remove any impurities wasn't a luxury. This bread was made with what was available. Instead of using commercial yeast, many medieval bakers relied on sourdough starter to leaven their bread, a method that was slower but much more dependable. The dough was left to rise in a warm corner of the kitchen where the natural wild yeasts could do their work, transforming the mixture into something capable of sustaining a family for days. Salt, which was precious and expensive, was often used sparingly, if at all. Once the dough was shaped into loaves, they were placed in communal ovens, if available, or baked directly on hot stones in a hearth. The result was a thick, almost armored crust that protected the soft, chewy, and moist interior. Rye bread had an impressive shelf life. It could last for days, even weeks, and would become even more durable over time. To bring it back to life, a simple dunk in soup or milk would make it as good as new. Peasants ate rye bread with almost everything: pottage, cheese, pickled vegetables, or just on its own. A slice in the morning, another in the evening, and sometimes more if you'd spent the day working the fields or chopping wood. The bread was a constant, unwavering companion, sustaining the hard-working peasant in their daily life. To try your own version of medieval rye bread, mix rye flour with warm water and a spoonful of sourdough starter. Add a pinch of salt, if desired. Let it rest and rise overnight, then shape it into a round loaf. Bake it slowly at a low temperature until it's golden brown. When it cools, slice it and enjoy the earthy, slightly tangy flavor and rustic chew that made rye bread a true peasant staple. Rye bread wasn't delicate. It wasn't fancy. But it was sturdy, soulful, and honest. Exactly what a medieval peasant could ask for in their daily meal. It was more than just food. It was a symbol of survival, a testament to the resilience of those who lived off the land, with the humble loaf as their constant companion. 3. Gruel, the meal that made you grateful to have anything. Gruel doesn't exactly have a reputation for being delicious. Mention it today and most people picture orphanages, scowling schoolmasters, or Dickensian desperation. But in medieval times, gruel was something entirely different. It was a lifeline. In a world where food was scarce and the threat of famine was ever present, a hot bowl of gruel could be the difference between feeling hunger gnaw at your belly or simply having something, anything, to fill you up. At its core, gruel was oatmeal's poorer, humbler cousin. It was thin, runny, and often bland, nothing fancy or indulgent. But it was cheap, easy to make, and perhaps most importantly, it could feed you when nothing else could. For the poorest peasants, gruel was often the staple of their diet, especially for breakfast and dinner. A bowl of it was a simple, if uninspiring, way to quiet a growling stomach and keep going throughout the long, laborious days. In a time when food could be unpredictable and crops might fail, gruel was something dependable, even if it wasn't exactly satisfying in the way we think of meals today. The basic ingredients for gruel were simple: oats or barley, boiled in water, or, if luck allowed, a thin broth made from whatever scraps could be found. On rare occasions, milk might be added to make it a little richer and tastier, though this was far from the norm. Salt was a valuable commodity and used sparingly, but when available, it offered the only seasoning. Sweeteners like honey, fruit, or sugar were luxuries few could afford, so gruel was often consumed plain. No bells and whistles, just a bowl of warmth and sustenance. Gruel wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to stretch. It was designed to stretch the grain, stretch your time, and stretch your energy. A pot of gruel could easily feed a family, providing just enough for everyone to stave off hunger for a few more hours. It didn't take much time to prepare, which was crucial for peasants who worked long hours in the fields. When you have little else, a pot of gruel is quick, easy, and reliable, offering warmth, comfort, and just enough nourishment to keep you going. To make your own version of medieval gruel today, start by combining a small handful of oats with 3 parts water. Bring it to a slow boil, stirring occasionally until it thickens slightly but remains soupy. Add salt to taste, or, if you're feeling indulgent, a touch of honey to sweeten it. Serve it hot, and feel that comforting warmth fill you up. While gruel often symbolized hardship, it also demonstrated the resilience and resourcefulness of those who made it. It turned humble, basic ingredients into something that could fuel a person through their day. It didn't have to be fancy, and it didn't have to be a feast. It was simply necessary. Gruel was a reminder that sometimes survival didn't require grand meals or intricate recipes. It just required the ability to make something from almost nothing and appreciate it for what it was. 4. Bean stew, the protein powerhouse. If there was one dish that could transform humble beans into a magical source of sustenance, it was bean stew. Beans, often considered the poor man's protein, were a lifesaver for medieval peasants. They could be dried, stored for months, and then tossed into a pot with water, herbs, and whatever other scraps were available to create a filling, nutritious meal. Bean stew wasn't fancy. There was no broth, no garnish, no delicate presentation, but it was undeniably practical. The peasants would soak their beans overnight, sometimes adding a few handfuls of lentils or peas for variety. A slow simmer over the hearth transformed these dried legumes into a hearty, filling stew, sometimes enriched with bits of leftover meat, usually not much more than a meaty bone or a few scraps of pork or chicken. The secret to a good bean stew was simplicity. The beans absorbed all the flavors around them, soaking up the richness of the stock and the earthiness of any vegetables added. Leeks, onions, and carrots were commonly used, and herbs like thyme or bay leaves would add depth. The result? A thick, protein-packed stew that could last days, feeding a peasant family with just a few basic ingredients. To make your own bean stew, start by soaking a cup of dried beans overnight. Drain and rinse them, then simmer them with water, an onion, and a few garlic cloves. Add in any root vegetables you have. Carrots or parsnips work wonders, and season with salt and herbs. Let the stew simmer for at least an hour until the beans are soft and the flavors meld together. It's not complicated, but it's a testament to the resourcefulness of medieval cooking. Whether served with a hunk of rye bread or a simple bowl of gruel, bean stew was a meal that filled you up and kept you going, the unsung hero of peasant kitchens for centuries. 5. Cabbage and leek soup, the garden's bounty. Cabbage and leek soup may not have the grandeur of roasted meats or lavish stews from a king's feast, but it was the cornerstone of many a peasant's meal. This humble dish was born from the hard-working garden, where vegetables like cabbage, sturdy and reliable, could be grown year-round, and leeks, able to endure even the harshest cold, were always available to harvest when needed most. Cabbage was a staple in medieval gardens because it was hardy and could thrive even with a little neglect, an essential quality for peasants who often had little time or energy to devote to their crops. When combined with leeks, another versatile and nutritious vegetable, it became a nourishing and filling soup. This soup was something that could be stretched over several days, providing a steady, dependable meal. The beauty of cabbage and leek soup was its flexibility. Depending on what ingredients you had at your disposal, it could be as simple as a handful of vegetables simmered in water, or richer if you were lucky enough to add a bit of meat, barley, or oats to thicken it up. At its core, cabbage and leek soup was made by slowly simmering chopped cabbage, leeks, and water, allowing the vegetables to soften and release their earthy flavors. A pinch of salt would be added to bring out the taste, and sometimes peasants might toss in a handful of barley or oats to make the soup more filling and hearty. This combination of ingredients created a warm, comforting dish that was perfect for those harsh winters when food was scarce. On rare occasions, a bit of salted pork or a leftover bone might be thrown in to add richness, but more often than not, the vegetables themselves were the star of the show. What made this soup so beloved was its simplicity. It didn't need anything extravagant to be delicious. It was the comfort food of medieval kitchens. The soup was typically prepared in large pots, so that the whole family could gather around and scoop their portion into bowls, often topped with a piece of rustic bread to soak up the flavorful broth. It became a communal experience, where the shared meal brought warmth to both body and spirit. To recreate this humble dish today, simply combine chopped cabbage and leeks in a pot with water or broth. Add a pinch of salt and let it simmer until the vegetables are tender. For a richer version, stir in some herbs or a dollop of butter if you like. The result will be a satisfying, nourishing meal, a perfect reflection of medieval cooking, resourceful, hearty, and deeply satisfying. 6. Pea soup, the frugal feast. There's a reason peasants loved pea soup. It was cheap, easy to make, and packed with nutrition. Dried peas were a pantry staple, and unlike the fresh peas you might find in a garden today, they could be stored and used in times of scarcity, making them a crucial element in the survival kitchen of the medieval peasant. Pea soup could be made with little more than dried peas, water, and some seasoning. On a good day, peasants might add onions, garlic, and herbs, while meat was a luxury only enjoyed by the wealthier classes. But even when made with just peas, water, and salt, this dish was a warming, filling meal that could sustain the most laborious days. One of the reasons pea soup was so valuable was that peas are packed with protein, making them a crucial part of a diet that often lacked sufficient meat. The soup's richness came from the beans themselves, which, when simmered for hours, softened into a creamy texture and absorbed the flavors of whatever vegetables or scraps were added to the pot. On rare occasions, peasants might toss in a small amount of salt pork or bacon, but even without it, pea soup was satisfying and nourishing. To make pea soup, soak a cup of dried peas overnight. In the morning, drain and rinse them, then place them in a pot with water, onions, and garlic. Simmer the mixture for at least an hour until the peas soften and the broth thickens. Add a handful of herbs, thyme or bay leaves work well, and salt to taste. It's simple, but the flavor is deep, earthy, and comforting. Pea soup was the ultimate frugal meal, providing hearty nourishment with minimal cost. And in the medieval world, where every coin counted, that's exactly what you needed to keep going. 7. Porridge, the breakfast of survivors. Breakfast in the medieval peasant kitchen wasn't about variety. It was about survival. And nothing was more synonymous with a hearty medieval breakfast than porridge. Whether made from oats, barley, or rye, porridge was the go-to dish to fuel the long, grueling workdays ahead. It was filling, easy to prepare, and could be eaten hot or cold, depending on what you had available. At its simplest, porridge was just grain boiled in water or milk. But depending on the season and the wealth of the household, it could be sweetened with honey or fruit. Porridge wasn't just for breakfast, though. It was a meal that could sustain a peasant through much of the day. The thick, hearty texture of the porridge could provide enough energy to last until supper, especially when paired with a piece of rye bread. Though the porridge might seem bland by modern standards, it was an essential part of the medieval diet. The grains provided carbohydrates for energy, while the occasional addition of butter, milk, or honey brought in needed fats and calories. During leaner times, porridge could be stretched with a bit of water and seasoned with salt to keep the peasant family full. To make medieval porridge, simply combine oats or barley with water or milk in a pot. Bring it to a gentle simmer, stirring regularly until it thickens to your liking. Add salt if you prefer savory porridge, or drizzle with honey for a sweet breakfast. Some even added dried fruit or nuts if they were lucky enough to have them. Porridge might not have been the most glamorous dish, but it was a lifesaver. It filled hungry bellies and gave peasants the energy to face another day in the fields. 8. Barley bread, the bread of the poor. Barley bread was the unsung hero of the medieval peasant table. While the wealthier classes feasted on light, airy wheat bread, the peasants made do with the denser, more filling barley bread. Barley, like rye, could grow in poor soil, making it the perfect crop for those who didn't have access to the fertile lands of the nobility. barley bread was more than just food. It was a necessity for survival. Barley bread was not the soft, pillowy loaf we imagine today. It was dense, hearty, and filling, with a slightly nutty flavor that came from the barley grain. The dough was heavy and sticky, often mixed with water and salt, and sometimes a bit of sourdough starter if it was available. The bread was baked in a simple oven or on hot stones, resulting in a dense, thick loaf with a hard crust and a chewy interior. Peasants often ate barley bread with soup, pottage, or cheese. The bread was sturdy enough to be dipped in stews and broths, soaking up all the flavors. When times were lean, barley bread might be the only thing standing between a peasant and starvation. To make a version of medieval barley bread, combine barley flour with water and a pinch of salt. Knead the dough until it's firm, then let it rise for several hours. Shape the dough into a round loaf and bake it in a hot oven or over a fire. The result will be a rustic, filling bread that can last for days. Barley bread wasn't fancy, but it was reliable. It was the bread of survival, plain, sturdy, and always there when you needed it most. 9. Salted fish, the preservation method. In a world without refrigeration, preserving food for the winter was crucial, and salted fish was one of the best ways to ensure a steady food supply. Fish was more abundant than meat, and when salted, it could last for months, enough to sustain a peasant family during the long, harsh winters. Salted fish wasn't just a way to survive. It was a meal that kept people going when fresh food was scarce. Salted fish was often dried or pickled, packed in salt to draw out the moisture and prevent spoilage. This method was especially useful for peasants who lived near bodies of water, where fish could be caught and preserved for later use. Cod, herring, and other fish varieties were salted and stored in wooden barrels or hung from rafters to dry. The beauty of salted fish was that it could be used in a variety of dishes. It could be thrown into a pot of pottage, chopped and mixed with grains, or simply eaten with a slice of bread. When prepared correctly, salted fish could have a strong, savory flavor that stood out in otherwise bland meals. To make salted fish, start with a fillet of fish, preferably a fatty variety like cod or herring. Pack it generously with salt, pressing it in to ensure the fish is fully covered. Let it sit for several days, then rinse off the excess salt before cooking. You can fry it, stew it, or serve it on rye bread with a little bit of vinegar. Salted fish was the medieval version of modern canned tuna, a cheap, long-lasting source of protein that could survive the leanest times. 10. Oatmeal with honey, a simple sweetness. Oatmeal with honey was a beloved comfort food for medieval peasants, providing both warmth and nourishment at the start of a long day. While it wasn't the syrup-drenched, sugar-laden breakfast that many of us enjoy today, it was a hearty and filling meal that gave peasants the energy they needed to face the arduous work ahead. Oats, easy to grow in poor soil and requiring little maintenance, made them an ideal crop for peasants. They were affordable, filling, and could be relied upon year after year to provide sustenance. In its most basic form, oatmeal was made by boiling oats in water, or on rarer occasions, milk, until the grains softened into a thick, creamy porridge. For peasants, this humble dish often served as a comforting start to their day. The addition of honey, which was a precious luxury and typically reserved for special occasions, provided a rare sweetness. Though honey was not something that could be enjoyed daily, on a cold winter morning, it transformed a simple bowl of oats into a small but cherished treat, a reminder that even in the harshest times, there was a touch of sweetness to be found in the everyday. To make oatmeal with honey, bring water or milk to a boil in a pot. Then stir in the oats and let them cook until they soften into a creamy consistency. Once the oatmeal has thickened, drizzle it with a little honey for sweetness. While it may seem simple, this modest breakfast provided a much-needed energy boost for peasants working in the fields or tending to chores. Oatmeal with honey may have been basic, but in a world where food was often scarce and the labor never ending, it was a nourishing, wholesome moment to savor. A quiet, comforting start to another hard day. 11. Turnips and root vegetables, the forgotten superfood. In the medieval world, turnips and other root vegetables were the unsung heroes of survival. Often overlooked in favor of more glamorous ingredients, these hearty, earthy vegetables provided the essential nutrients peasants needed to get through long winters and days filled with grueling labor. They were cheap, easy to grow, and incredibly resilient, able to withstand harsh weather and poor soil. Turnips, in particular, were a staple crop for peasants. They could be grown in almost any climate and were perfect for planting in late summer and early fall. Once harvested, turnips could be eaten fresh, but more often they were boiled or stewed in pottage, soups, or simple vegetable dishes. They had a mildly sweet, earthy flavor and were filling without being overly rich, perfect for stretching a meal when resources were limited. Other root vegetables like carrots, parsnips, and rutabagas also found their way into peasant kitchens. These vegetables were a key part of the medieval diet, often used in stews, pies, or simply boiled and served with a bit of salt and fat. To make a simple turnip stew, start by peeling and chopping turnips into chunks. Boil them in water until tender, then add a handful of carrots or parsnips if you have them. Season with a pinch of salt, a bit of thyme, and a splash of vinegar if available. Simmer until everything is soft and flavorful. If you're lucky enough to have some meat, throw in a meaty bone to add richness. Root vegetables, despite their humble nature, were packed with fiber, vitamins, and minerals. They were the foundation of many medieval peasant meals, providing the necessary sustenance to keep people alive and healthy throughout the year. So, next time you're enjoying a hearty root vegetable dish, remember, you're partaking in a tradition that stretches back centuries, born from the soil and cultivated by the sweat of hardworking hands. 12. Lentils, the tiny powerhouse. Lentils may be small, but don't let their size fool you. These tiny legumes were a powerhouse in the medieval diet, offering a cheap and abundant source of protein. For peasants who couldn't afford meat, lentils provided an essential substitute. High in fiber, iron, and other vital nutrients, lentils were perfect for sustaining hard-working bodies. Lentils were often dried and stored for long periods, making them ideal for survival when fresh vegetables were scarce. When cooked, lentils transformed into a thick, hearty stew or soup, filling bellies and providing energy for a day of hard labor. Peasants could often pair lentils with herbs, onions, and a splash of vinegar to add flavor. And if they were fortunate enough, a small amount of salt pork or dried fish might make an appearance. Lentil soup was simple to prepare and required few ingredients. It was a beloved dish in many medieval kitchens, especially during times of scarcity. Lentils were an adaptable food. They could be stewed, boiled, or even mashed into a paste, depending on what the cook had on hand. To make your own lentil soup, begin by soaking a cup of dried lentils overnight. Drain and rinse them, then cook them in a pot with water, onions, and garlic. If you have them, add some herbs like thyme or bay leaves for extra flavor. Simmer for an hour or two until the lentils are tender and the broth thickens. For an extra touch, add a little salt or pepper to taste. Lentils weren't just cheap, they were filling, nutritious, and versatile, making them a key ingredient in the medieval peasant kitchen. Whether eaten alone or combined with other vegetables, lentils provided the sustenance necessary to survive the harsh realities of medieval life. 13. Peasant pie, a crusty comfort. When it came to making the most out of limited ingredients, medieval peasants were masters of creating hearty, filling dishes from whatever scraps they could gather. Peasant pie, while simple, was a beloved comfort food that managed to be both practical and satisfying. This humble pie was a perfect example of how ingenuity and resourcefulness could stretch even the smallest portion of food into something that would fill the belly and warm the heart. Made from whatever vegetables, grains, or meats could be scavenged from the garden or butcher's leftovers, peasant pie was a dish that made no demands, just a willingness to use what was available. The crust of a peasant pie was usually a no-frills mixture of flour and water, often lacking the richness of butter or lard that would come with a more refined recipe. If any fat was available, it might come from bacon, pork, or even animal drippings. The goal wasn't to create a buttery, flaky pastry, but to provide a sturdy base and topping to hold together the filling and keep the meal hearty. The beauty of the pie lay in its versatility. Depending on what was available in the garden or leftover from previous meals, the filling could vary widely. Root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and parsnips were common, as were onions and leeks. A touch of herbs, perhaps thyme, rosemary, or parsley, would add flavor. In times when meat was scarce, the pie might be made entirely of vegetables, herbs, and whatever remnants from past meals could be salvaged. To make a medieval-style peasant pie, begin by preparing a basic pastry dough made with flour, water, and a pinch of salt. Roll the dough out and fit it into a baking dish. For the filling, combine a mix of root vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and onions. If you're fortunate enough to have some leftover meat, chop it up and add it to the mixture. Season generously with herbs such as thyme and rosemary, and add a pinch of salt. Once the filling is ready, cover it with another layer of dough and bake until golden brown and crisp. Peasant pies weren't just about the food, they were about resourcefulness. They symbolized the ability to make something nourishing out of the simplest ingredients. While they may not have won awards for elegance or finesse, peasant pies were a meal that made the most of what the land and the kitchen had to offer. And in the medieval world, that was a small triumph in itself. 14. Stewed lamb, when meat was a luxury. In the medieval peasant diet, meat was a rarity. The animals that grazed on the land were often reserved for the nobility, and peasants rarely had the means to afford fresh meat. But when the rare opportunity to enjoy meat did arise, stewed lamb was a cherished dish. Lamb was a popular choice because it was easy to raise, and even if only a small amount of meat was available, it could be stretched by simmering in a stew with vegetables, herbs, and water. Stewing meat, particularly lamb, allowed it to be tenderized over the course of hours, soaking up the flavors of herbs and broth. The peasants might use lamb sparingly, perhaps a few cuts from a newly butchered sheep or a bit of leftover meat from a feast. Often, stewed lamb would be combined with root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and onions to create a flavorful and filling dish that could feed several people. Stewed lamb also allowed peasants to get the most out of every scrap. The bones, marrow, and even the fat were utilized, adding richness and depth to the stew. Peasants were masters of frugality, and nothing went to waste in their kitchens. Even in times of scarcity, a pot of stewed lamb could be the highlight of a peasant's week. To make stewed lamb, start by cutting lamb into chunks. Brown the meat in a pot with some oil or fat, then add chopped onions, garlic, and root vegetables. Cover with water and add herbs like rosemary and thyme. Simmer the stew for several hours, letting the flavors meld together and the meat become tender. Stewed lamb was more than just food. It was a rare treat that brought comfort and nourishment when meat was hard to come by, showing the resilience and creativity of medieval peasants who made do with what little they had. 15. Ale and bread, the peasant's drink. In medieval times, ale was far more than just a drink. It was a staple of daily life, particularly for peasants. Unlike today, where water is considered the safest choice for hydration, medieval people often preferred ale because it was safer to drink than water, which could be contaminated. For peasants, ale was a reliable source of calories and nutrients, and it often accompanied every meal of the day. Paired with a hunk of hearty rye or barley bread, ale became the peasant's drink of choice. Simple, sustaining, and reliable. Brewing ale wasn't a sophisticated art in the medieval world. It was a household chore, one that peasants could easily master. Ale was made with water, barley, and hops, though the latter wasn't always available in abundance. Sometimes, ale would be brewed in large batches, and the entire village would share the fruits of the labor. The alcohol content was relatively low, making it a drink for all ages, though it was still potent enough to be considered a meal in itself. The bread that accompanied ale was equally unpretentious, typically made from rye or barley, dense and filling. The bread could be torn into chunks and dunked into the ale, which was a common way to consume both foods. The bread absorbed the liquid, and the combination of the two provided the necessary sustenance for a long, hard day's work. To make medieval-style ale, mix barley with water and allow it to ferment. The result is a rustic, slightly sour drink that pairs perfectly with your bread. For bread, make a simple dough from rye flour, water, and salt, and bake it in a hot oven or over coals. The hearty bread and refreshing ale make for a simple yet effective meal that kept peasants hydrated and energized. Ale and bread weren't just a meal, they were a way of life, a testament to the ingenuity of peasants who made the most of what they had to survive. 16. Leek and onion pie, a simple, savory delight. Leeks and onions were among the most versatile vegetables found in the medieval peasant garden. These humble yet flavorful ingredients found their way into countless dishes, often making up the base for the most beloved medieval pies. While meat-filled pies were reserved for the wealthier classes, peasants made do with what they had, creating pies stuffed with vegetables and whatever bits of fat or cheese could be scraped together. The leek and onion pie was one such creation. It wasn't just a way to use up surplus leeks and onions, it was a delicious way to make a meal stretch further. The crust was often simple: flour, water, and perhaps a little lard if the family was fortunate. The filling, however, was where the magic happened. Leeks, onions, and a bit of herbs like thyme or parsley were slowly cooked until tender and sweet. If available, a small amount of cheese might be added, and if there was any leftover meat from a feast, it was chopped and stirred into the mix. The pie's beauty lay in its simplicity. With just a few ingredients, peasants could create a meal that was both filling and flavorful, capable of serving multiple people and stretching over several days. The pie could be eaten cold, making it a perfect leftover dish, and its hearty nature ensured that the peasant could face another long day of work. To make a leek and onion pie today, start by rolling out a simple pastry crust made from flour, water, and a pinch of salt. For the filling, sauté chopped leeks and onions in a bit of oil until they're tender and lightly caramelized. If you have cheese, crumble it into the mix. Pour the filling into the crust, cover with another layer of dough, and bake until golden and crispy. The result is a rustic pie that echoes the resourcefulness of medieval kitchens. 17. Barley porridge, the comfort of simplicity. Barley was one of the most widely grown grains in medieval Europe, and barley porridge became an essential part of the peasant diet. In a world where food was often scarce, barley porridge was a comforting, reliable meal that provided energy for the long hours spent in the fields or at the hearth. It was simple to make, and depending on what was available, it could be served sweet or savory. Barley porridge was often made by boiling the barley in water or milk. The grain would absorb the liquid, swelling up into a thick, creamy consistency. When money was tight, it was common to have barley porridge for both breakfast and dinner, and it often formed the basis for meals that were eaten throughout the day. On special occasions, if honey or fruit was available, the porridge could be sweetened, but more often, it was eaten with a bit of salt or herbs for a savory twist. The simplicity of barley porridge made it a cornerstone of peasant life. It could be eaten alone or served with bread, and in some regions, it was used as a base for other dishes, such as pottage. The key to a good barley porridge was to cook the grain slowly, allowing it to become soft and fully absorb the liquid. Though humble, this dish was packed with nutrients, fiber, carbohydrates, and a bit of protein, providing a steady source of energy to help peasants get through their day. To make your own barley porridge, bring 3 cups of water or milk to a simmer, then stir in 1 cup of barley. Let it cook for 30 to 40 minutes, stirring occasionally until it thickens into a creamy porridge. Add a pinch of salt or a drizzle of honey, depending on your preference. The result will be a comforting, warming dish that reflects the humble resourcefulness of the medieval peasant kitchen. 18. Herb soup, the garden's gift. In the medieval world, herbs were far more than simple flavorings. They were a lifeline. Peasants relied on herbs not only to season their food, but also to enhance its medicinal qualities. In an era when fresh food was hard to come by, and illness was a constant threat, herbs were essential for both nourishment and health. Herb soup was one of the simplest yet most effective meals in the peasant diet, made with whatever herbs could be found in the garden or the wilds. This humble dish was light, refreshing, and packed with the flavors of the seasons, offering both comfort and practicality. Herb soup was typically made by boiling a mixture of wild and cultivated herbs in water. The herbs were often picked from the garden or foraged from nearby woods, with peasants selecting whatever was available at the time. Common herbs like parsley, thyme, sage, and marjoram were staples, while wild greens such as nettles and sorrel added an earthy richness to the soup. If vegetables or roots like onions, leeks, and carrots were on hand, they were added to make the soup more filling and flavorful. In the absence of meat, herbs and vegetables were the primary sources of taste, transforming what could have been a bland bowl of water into a satisfying and nourishing dish. What made herb soup so special was its simplicity and versatility. With just a handful of fresh herbs and whatever vegetables were available, peasants could craft a meal that was both nutritious and flavorful. The herbs themselves were packed with vitamins and minerals, offering health benefits that were crucial during lean times or when food was scarce. The soup was often eaten with thick slices of bread, which could be dipped into the broth to absorb the flavors and add substance to the meal. To recreate this medieval comfort food today, start by bringing a pot of water to a boil and adding a variety of herbs such as thyme, rosemary, parsley, and sage. Then, add chopped vegetables like onions, leeks, and carrots. Season with a pinch of salt and pepper, and let the soup simmer for about 30 minutes until the vegetables are tender and the flavors have melded together. The result will be a fragrant herbal broth that recalls the resourcefulness and practicality of medieval peasant meals made with ingredients from the garden and the wild. Herb soup was more than just a meal. It was a reflection of the medieval peasants' connection to the earth, their knowledge of the land, and their ability to make the most of what nature provided. It was a nourishing, simple dish that not only filled the stomach, but also helped to preserve health and provide sustenance during difficult times. 19. Cabbage and bacon, a simple, satisfying dish. Cabbage and bacon may seem like an unlikely pairing, but it was a beloved and often repeated dish in medieval peasant kitchens. In a time when meat was considered a luxury and rarely seen on the table, even a small amount of bacon could transform a humble vegetable into a hearty and satisfying meal. The smoky, salty bacon provided the necessary fat and flavor, while the cabbage added bulk and sustenance, making this dish perfect for feeding a family on a tight budget. It was the kind of meal that turned minimal ingredients into something substantial enough to nourish a household. Cabbage was a vegetable that thrived in the cold months, making it a staple crop in many medieval gardens. It could withstand frost and grow well in poor, neglected soil, which made it especially valuable to peasants who needed crops that could survive the elements. Even better, cabbage could be stored for months in cool, dry conditions, providing fresh greens during the winter when other vegetables were hard to come by. It was an essential source of vitamins and fiber when fresh food was in short supply. Bacon, on the other hand, while not an everyday food, could be salted and preserved for long periods, ensuring that even in times of scarcity, a little meat could be added to the pot. The smoky, savory flavor of bacon perfectly complemented the mild, earthy taste of cabbage, making the two a surprisingly delicious match. To prepare cabbage and bacon, the bacon was first fried or rendered in a pot to release its fat. The bacon's fat was the key to giving the dish its depth of flavor. Once the bacon was crispy, it was removed from the pot and chopped cabbage was added, cooking down in the leftover bacon fat. The cabbage absorbed the smoky richness from the bacon, turning tender and flavorful. For added complexity, peasants sometimes added onions or garlic, and on occasion, a splash of vinegar to balance out the richness with a little acidity. But the beauty of this dish was in its simplicity. The focus was always on making the most of what was available, stretching a small amount of meat to create a meal that could satisfy everyone at the table. To recreate this medieval comfort food today, start by frying a few slices of bacon in a large pot until crispy. Remove the bacon and set it aside, then add chopped cabbage to the pot, letting it cook in the rendered bacon fat. Stir frequently until the cabbage wilts and becomes tender, absorbing the savory flavors of the bacon. Crumble the cooked bacon back into the cabbage and season with salt, pepper, and a dash of vinegar for a touch of tang. Cabbage and bacon was more than just a dish. It was the embodiment of medieval resourcefulness. It was a simple, comforting meal that made the most out of the ingredients at hand, turning basic, everyday items into something that felt rich and satisfying. In a world of limited resources, dishes like this showed how creativity and a little salt could go a long way in feeding a family and making the most of what was available. 20. Apple and pear stew, a sweet, seasonal treat. In a world without sugar, fruit was a rare and precious indulgence. The sweetness of apples and pears, grown in orchards or gathered from the wild, provided a rare opportunity for medieval peasants to enjoy nature's candy. These fruits could be eaten fresh when in season, but they also served as a valuable way to preserve the harvest, providing some much-needed sweetness long after the harvest months had passed. Apple and pear stew was one of the ways peasants made the most of these fruits, transforming them into a warming, comforting dish that could be enjoyed in multiple ways, either as a sweet dessert or as a delightful side to a savory meal. Apple and pear stew was a dish that reflected the simple ingenuity of medieval cooks. The stew itself often combined apples and pears with a touch of honey or fruit juice to bring out the fruit's natural sweetness. In a time when sugar was virtually non-existent and costly if it was available, the sweetness from the fruit itself was more than enough to satisfy any craving. The fruit was simmered gently in water or cider, both of which were common liquids on a peasant's table, until the pieces softened and melded together into a thick, syrupy stew. This dish was a prime example of how medieval cooks took advantage of the limited ingredients they had, finding richness and comfort in what was available. Spices were sometimes added to elevate the flavors of the stew. A sprinkle of cinnamon or a few cloves could be tossed in, warming the dish with familiar autumnal notes. A hint of ginger might be added for an extra kick, balancing the natural sweetness with just a touch of heat. Though not an everyday dish, apple and pear stew was a simple and satisfying way to end a meal on a sweet note. It could be served on its own, enjoyed as a dessert, or paired with a hunk of crusty bread to soak up the delicious syrup. This dish was particularly popular in the autumn months when apples and pears were in abundance, and it became a way to preserve the flavors of the harvest for later enjoyment. By cooking the fruit down into a stew, peasants could prolong its use, and they could even preserve it through canning or storing it in jars to enjoy in the cold winter months. The ability to enjoy a bit of sweetness during those long, dark months was a small but appreciated luxury, and apple and pear stew was an ideal way to make the most of the bountiful fall harvest. To recreate apple and pear stew today, peel and chop apples and pears into bite-sized chunks. Place the fruit in a pot with a little water or cider and simmer it over low heat until the fruit becomes tender and begins to break down. Add honey to taste and season with cinnamon, cloves, or a pinch of ginger for a comforting, spiced flavor. Let the stew cook until the liquid thickens slightly, turning it into a syrupy, sweet treat that captures the essence of the harvest season. Apple and pear stew is more than just a sweet dish. It's a reflection of the resourcefulness of medieval cooks who took advantage of the seasons to create dishes that not only nourished but also provided a bit of indulgence in a world where sweetness was a rare gift. The warming combination of tender fruit and gentle spices is a simple pleasure that continues to evoke the cozy, seasonal spirit of medieval life. 21. Mushroom and herb stew, the wild's bounty. In the medieval peasant kitchen, mushrooms were considered a seasonal treasure. Foraging for wild mushrooms was a skill passed down through generations, and it was an essential part of the peasant's diet during the autumn months. Mushroom and herb stew was a simple yet flavorful dish, made from whatever mushrooms could be gathered from the forest floor. When combined with herbs and a bit of vegetables, this dish provided a comforting meal that felt like a connection to the earth. Mushrooms, while considered a delicacy by some, were a vital part of medieval diets, especially for peasants. They were easily found in the woods, and with the right knowledge, mushrooms could be harvested safely. Peasants would collect wild mushrooms like chanterelles, boletus, and morel, all of which were hardy and full of flavor. When mixed with garden herbs like thyme, rosemary, and parsley, mushrooms provided the base for a rich, earthy stew that would warm even the coldest of nights. The stew was made by sautéing the mushrooms and onions in a bit of fat, typically animal fat or butter if available. Water or broth was added, and the mixture was simmered until everything was tender. Fresh herbs were tossed in to season the stew, and a pinch of salt added the final touch. Sometimes, peasants added a handful of barley or lentils to thicken the soup and stretch it further. To make a version today, begin by sautéing chopped mushrooms and onions in a bit of butter or oil. Add garlic and fresh herbs like thyme or rosemary, and let the flavors infuse. Pour in vegetable or chicken broth, bring to a simmer, and let cook for about 30 minutes. If you'd like a thicker stew, add barley or lentils in the last 15 minutes of cooking. This mushroom and herb stew is a great example of how medieval peasants could turn something as simple as wild mushrooms into a flavorful, hearty meal that was as much about resourcefulness as it was about taste. 22. Cheese and herb dumplings, a comforting bite. While peasants didn't often have access to rich meats or luxuries like butter cheese when available, was a treasure in itself. Cheese and herb dumplings were a delicious way to stretch what little cheese was available and turn it into something filling and satisfying. These little dumplings, often served in soups or stews, were a great way to add flavor and texture to a humble meal. The dumplings were made by combining cheese, flour, and water, or sometimes milk if it was available, to form a dough. The dough was mixed with fresh herbs from the garden, like parsley, thyme, or chives, and then dropped into a pot of simmering water or soup. The cheese inside melted into a creamy filling, and the herbs added a burst of freshness to the dough. These dumplings could be served on their own or as a side dish, often paired with vegetable soups or pottages. Peasants would make the most out of whatever cheese was available, whether it was a hard, aged cheese or a softer, more crumbly variety. The herbs they used were often homegrown, allowing them to season their food even when spices were too expensive to purchase. When cheese was scarce, a bit of whey from butter making could also be used to make the dumplings, stretching the precious cheese even further. To make cheese and herb dumplings, combine flour, grated cheese, and fresh herbs in a bowl. Add enough water to form a thick dough. Roll the dough into small balls and drop them into boiling water or broth. Let them cook for 10 to 15 minutes until they float to the surface and are cooked through. These dumplings can be added to soups, stews, or eaten on their own. Cheese and herb dumplings remind us that even in times of scarcity, peasants could create comforting, flavorful meals from simple, accessible ingredients. 23. Spelt porridge, the ancient grain. Spelt was one of the oldest grains cultivated by medieval peasants, and it was prized for its ability to grow in poor soil. It was a reliable crop that could withstand harsh conditions and provide much-needed sustenance. Spelt porridge was a staple meal for peasants, filling bellies and providing energy for the long, physically demanding days in the fields. Spelt porridge was very similar to barley porridge, but spelt had a slightly nuttier flavor and a firmer texture. It was boiled with water or milk until it softened and formed a creamy, filling dish. In times when milk was scarce, water was used as the base, and the porridge was often eaten with a sprinkle of salt or a drizzle of honey, depending on what was available. One of the main reasons spelt porridge was so valued by medieval peasants was its nutritional content. It was rich in fiber, vitamins, and minerals, providing essential nutrients that helped peasants maintain strength during the harvest season or the winter months. The porridge was often paired with bread or cheese to round out the meal and make it more satisfying. To make spelt porridge, rinse and soak spelt berries overnight. In the morning, add the soaked spelt to a pot with water or milk and bring it to a simmer. Let it cook for 45 minutes to an hour until the grains have softened and absorbed the liquid. Add salt for savory porridge or honey for sweetness. This simple yet nutritious dish was a foundation of medieval peasant diets, allowing them to thrive even in the harshest conditions. Spelt porridge is a reminder of how medieval peasants made use of ancient grains to create meals that were both simple and nourishing, utilizing the earth's bounty for survival. 24. Root vegetable mash, a hearty comfort. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and parsnips were a mainstay of the medieval peasant diet. They were inexpensive, easy to grow, and could be stored for months, making them invaluable during the winter when fresh produce was scarce. One of the simplest yet most comforting ways to prepare these vegetables was in a root vegetable mash, a dish that could be served as a side or a main meal, depending on the amount of vegetables available. Root vegetable mash was essentially a humble vegetable puree, made by boiling root vegetables until they were tender and then mashing them into a smooth or chunky consistency. While salt and water were the basic ingredients, peasants often added whatever flavorings they could, herbs, a bit of butter, or even a splash of vinegar to balance the richness of the dish. The beauty of root vegetable mash was that it was versatile. It could be eaten on its own as a simple, filling meal, or served alongside a more substantial dish like stew or bread. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots were often used in combination, creating a mash with layers of flavor. The vegetable's natural sweetness was tempered by the salt and vinegar, and the mash provided much-needed carbohydrates to fuel a long day's work. To make a root vegetable mash today, peel and chop a mix of root vegetables, turnips, carrots, parsnips, or even sweet potatoes. Boil them in water or broth until tender, then mash them with a little butter or olive oil. Add salt and pepper to taste, and a dash of vinegar if you want a bit of tang. The result is a smooth, comforting dish that pays homage to the resourcefulness of medieval cooks. Root vegetable mash was a dish that reflected the simple yet satisfying meals peasants relied on to survive and thrive. 25. Winter apple compote, a sweet end to a simple meal. As winter settled in and the harvest season came to a close, apples were one of the few fruits that could be stored for long periods. The medieval peasant had a deep understanding of how to preserve the fruits of the land, and apple compote became a cherished treat during the colder months. This simple, rustic dessert was made by stewing apples with a bit of sugar or honey, along with spices like cinnamon or cloves, if they could afford them. Apple compote was a warm, comforting dish, perfect for soothing cold bones after a day spent outside in the fields. The apples were simmered in water or cider until they softened and absorbed the spices. On rare occasions, honey was used to sweeten the compote, but it was a luxury reserved for special days. In medieval times, sweet desserts like apple compote were often reserved for the holidays or the occasional feast. For peasants, the compote was a rare indulgence, a reminder of the pleasures that could be found even in the harshest seasons. It was typically served with a slice of bread, or sometimes eaten on its own as a sweet treat after a meal. To make apple compote today, peel and core several apples, then slice them into chunks. Place them in a pot with a splash of cider or water and simmer until they're soft and breaking apart. Add honey or sugar to taste, along with a pinch of cinnamon or cloves if desired. Simmer for 15 to 20 minutes until the apples have absorbed the flavors. The result is a fragrant, warm dish that transports you to medieval kitchens, where every bite of sweetness was savored and cherished. Apple compote was more than just a dessert. It was a symbol of the season's bounty, reminding peasants of the harvest's rewards, even in the depths of winter. The resilience of the medieval peasant kitchen. The medieval peasant kitchen wasn't a place of luxury or indulgence, but it was undoubtedly a testament to human resilience. In a world often marked by famine, disease, and harsh conditions, the ability to turn humble ingredients into life-sustaining meals was nothing short of remarkable. Peasants may not have had the abundance of spices or the riches of the nobility, but they had something far more powerful: resourcefulness. Every dish we've explored, the pottage, the rye bread, the cheese dumplings, was born from a necessity to survive, to make do with whatever was at hand. Meals were more than just food. They were an expression of the land itself. They were born from the soil, harvested from the garden, gathered from the wild, and passed down through generations. Each meal was a quiet act of survival, a reminder that, no matter the circumstances, there was always something to be had from the earth. What stands out is how peasants managed to thrive with so little. There were no fancy ingredients, no elaborate recipes, but with a handful of barley, a few root vegetables, and a dash of creativity, they could fill their bellies and their hearts. And perhaps, in a world that often felt uncertain, the kitchen was a place where they could find comfort in simplicity. In the end, the medieval peasant kitchen was a reflection of the people who worked tirelessly within it. Pragmatic, inventive, and unwavering, these meals, humble as they were, laid the foundation for many of the foods we cherish today. So, as we close the book on this journey, let's remember the resilience of those who, through nothing but necessity and ingenuity, created dishes that not only sustained them, but shaped the course of history.